All right, this is the last part of Lecture 2. So this is Lecture 2C for History 111 for September 2nd, 2020. I'm going to talk about the Hebrews, which were a people that were the ancestors of the Jews. And I just want to place them into the context of Egypt and Sumeria. So let me talk about their origins. I mean, most of our knowledge of ancient Hebrew history comes from the actual Bible, the Old Testament, although there's been a lot of archaeological digging in the last half of the 20th century, especially in Israel, that's filled in a lot of the picture with archaeological evidence. But there's still a lot of things that we only know from the Bible. So according to the Bible, the sort of founder of the Hebrew people was Abraham, who came from Sumeria. He actually came from the city of Ur, which is one of the cities in ancient Sumeria, and he was a nomadic person. So he tended sheep and goats and such, and he moved them along the edge of Mesopotamia is the desert, the Arabian desert, and he moved along the northern edge of the Arabian desert in this sort of grasslands and things like that were not good for agriculture, but they were good for sheep and goats and such. And so he moved along there, and in the process of wandering along the edge of the desert, he came to Palestine and settled in Palestine. But then the Hebrews moved to Egypt after that for a while, and then under Moses, they left Egypt and moved back to returned to Palestine. And so they're probably back in Palestine by the 13th or 14th century BCE. Now, for most of the time that the Hebrews were living in Palestine, Palestine was actually this sort of narrow strip of fertile land that connected Egypt up to Syria and then Mesopotamia. And Palestine was just always under the control of either one of the Mesopotamian empires, like the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, etc., or one of the Egyptian empires, like the Old or Middle Kingdoms. However, about the year 1000, Israel found itself temporarily in a state of independence. And the reason for this was that you had the Assyrian, or the Hittites, their rule of the Assyrian Empire collapsed, and so Assyria was in a state of chaos. And then at about the same time, in 1080 BCE, you had the new kingdom of Egypt collapsed also and was conquered by the Hyksos. And so for this brief period, neither one of the empires was trying to control Israel. And so Israel was, for a brief moment, independent. And in this moment of independence, the Hebrew people founded a single kingdom called Judea, first by Saul. We don't have any direct archaeological evidence of Saul. He is only mentioned in the Bible as the founder of this kingdom. If he lived, he was somewhere around 1000 BCE. Then he was succeeded by David, and we do know David existed because we have archaeological evidence saying, King David, stones in fortresses that said, have King David's name on the cornerstone. David lived somewhere around 1000 BCE. He probably died in 965 BCE. He was succeeded by his son Solomon, and we get some of that evidence from the Bible, but also evidence from other sources that Solomon also existed, 965 to 925 BCE. Now, after Solomon's death, the kingdom of Judea split into two. And there was a northern part called Israel and a southern part called Judea. All right? And it split because Solomon's sons got into a sort of a civil war with each other, and they essentially split the kingdom, and one son took the north and one son took the south. So after Solomon, it's not a unified kingdom anymore. And so now you have two kingdoms, Israel and Judea, who are still living independently. But it was only a matter of time before either the Assyrians in the north or the Egyptians in the south would get their act together and then try to conquer Israel again. And the end finally came, for the northern kingdom, in 722 BCE, the Assyrians came down and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And they did something. They took the majority of the population and they spread them out throughout the Assyrian Empire. They basically took them out of Palestine, out of the kingdom of Israel, and they spread them out amongst the Assyrian population in other cities up in modern-day Syria or Iraq or etc. And essentially, that Hebrew people, they disappeared from history because they simply began to intermarry with the Assyrian population. They adopted Assyrian culture, and they sort of disappeared as a distinct group. They just became Assyrians. But Judea still existed, and the Assyrian Empire was actually conquered by the New Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar in the 500s, and then this New Babylonian Empire conquered Judea in 586 BCE. And so that was the end of the Hebrew people as an independent kingdom. Now, the Babylonians also decided, just like the Assyrians had, that they were going to take a significant portion of the population of Judea and spread them out throughout the Babylonian Empire. So they took all the priests and all the leaders, all the wealthy people from the kingdom of Judea, and they took them actually back to Babylon. And so for a period of 50 years or so, the leaders, all the leaders and elites and the educated priests, etc., of the Hebrew people were living in Babylon in captivity, and this period is called the Babylonian captivity. And it's during that time that an interesting thing happened. And I'll talk more about this when I get to the religion, but it's really then that you see the Hebrews develop what you would call Judaism as a religion. Okay? So they're in the Babylonian captivity. Well, in 538, another group called the Persians, which I'll talk about in a later lecture, conquer the kingdom of Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire, and they allow the Hebrew people to return to Judea. Now, a lot of the poor people, the poor Hebrews Hebrew people had stayed in Judea, right? They had been farmers, etc., living under the Babylonians. Well, now the elites come back, and they have to sort of rebuild Hebrew society under. Now it's the Persians who control the whole shebang. But now they've actually created this sort of new religion called Judaism. So I want to talk about their religion. Judaism was really interesting because its origins were very similar to the Mesopotamian religions, which had multiple gods, and what was sort of standard, and we'll see this in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is that in Mesopotamian society, there were multiple gods, and each city would sort of pick a patron to be the patron god to sort of be the protector of that city, and they would sometimes they'd even name the city after that god. Incidentally, the city of Athens is named after Athena, in the similar process in Greece. And so each city had a god or a goddess that was sort of their protector. And initially, the Hebrew people had their god also. Their god was called Yahweh or Jehovah. The Hebrew letters that spell Yahweh or Jehovah, the alphabet letters can be translated into English in several ways. They have one character that's both I or Y and J, so it could be either a Y or a J, we don't know. And the V and W split later, so they were one character then. But what's interesting about Hebrew is that you don't write the vowels. You only write the consonants. And so we know that that's the name of God, but we don't know how they pronounced it. Was it Yahweh or was it Jehovah? Both translations are valid because we just don't know how they said it. And the reason we don't know how they said it, which is kind of interesting, is that the name of God was not supposed to be spoken out loud. It was considered sacrilege to speak the name of God out loud. The name of God was a four-letter word. In fact, that's where the phrase, the four-letter word, comes. It's the four-letter word you don't say out loud. The only time it could be spoken was in the temple in Jerusalem, which was the main central temple for the Hebrew people. In the temple, once a year, they would have a ceremony in the inner sanctum, the innermost chamber of the temple, the holiest of holies. The high priest would say the name of God once in there, in one ceremony once a year. And the other priests would stand around outside the room banging on drums and blowing horns so that nobody could hear the name of God spoken. And because of that, we actually don't know after the Babylonian captivity how you say it, right? But during the Babylonian captivity, well, let me back up for a second. For the Hebrew people, Yahweh or Jehovah was their God, and gods were thought to be kind of tied to that place. They protected this region, and you would have a temple to that god, and the god was thought to sort of reside in that temple. And for the Hebrew people, it was Jerusalem, and they had a temple in Jerusalem. Solomon, in particular, had built an enormous temple in Jerusalem, and it was destroyed by the Babylonians. Okay. Now, for a lot of the ancient Middle East religions, that would have been the death of their religion, because clearly their god had been destroyed because he wasn't powerful enough to stop them from destroying his temple, and there was no place to worship him because you could only worship him in that temple, right? But the Hebrew people did an amazing thing during the Babylonian captivity. They said, wait a second, maybe our God is not tied to that temple over there where we can't get to him anymore. Maybe our God is everywhere. And they made a couple of really crucial shifts in their religion. The first was, they said, maybe our God is universal. Maybe he is everywhere. Maybe our God created the whole world and he's everywhere in the world. He's not tied to one place. Then they made a second thing. They said, if our God created the world, then all those other gods didn't create the world and they're fake. And so the Hebrew people began to say, our God is the only real God. All the other gods that all the other people and all the other cities and all the other religions worship are fake. Okay? So they've created one universal God, which is to say monotheism. But then they made another interesting decision. They decided that if their God was not bound by space, he was maybe bound more by time. And it's during the Babylonian captivity that Hebrew scholars began to really write down what would become many of the books of the Old Testament. In particular, the book of Genesis was written during the Babylonian captivity. And what's kind of interesting is the Babylonians had a creation narrative about how the world was created, and it was about space, right? God created this place and that place. And the Hebrew people rewrote that, and they wrote it as the book of Genesis, where God created things over days, over time. He's not bound by space anymore. He's doing it through time. And this is part of the way that the Hebrew people were sort of changing their religion so it was not based on a place. It was based on time. Another interesting thing that the Hebrew people did is they said, if our God is the God of everyone, but we see him as our protector, we have a special relationship with him. And this is where the Hebrew people really got innovative. They said, they came back from the Babylonian captivity saying, our God made a deal with us. He made a covenant with us. In fact, he made a covenant with Abraham, and he renewed that covenant with Moses. And that covenant said that the Hebrew people are his chosen people. And he has a special relationship to them. And they then interpreted everything through that special relationship with God. And in particular, they interpreted the destruction of Israel and the destruction of Judea and the Babylonian captivity. They said, we made God angry. And he punished us by destroying our kingdoms and sending us through the Babylonian captivity, but then he saved us again to give us a second chance. And they said, well, what did we do that made him angry? Well, Moses had written down this sort of 10 commandments, these laws, and the Hebrew people began to say, well, maybe God wants us to really obey those laws. Maybe that was the problem, was we weren't obeying the 10 commandments. In particular, the first one, which is there's only one God, and it's Yahweh, and you can't put any other gods before him. So maybe we'd been listening too much to Mesopotamian or Babylonian gods. Maybe we had been not worshiping correctly. And so they formulated a new idea, a whole new idea of a religion. Because now it's not that God doesn't care about human beings. Remember, the Mesopotamian religion is God doesn't really care about human beings. And it's a transactional thing. You offer God sacrifices and God gives you something in return. Well, the Hebrew people said it's not like that. We have an ongoing relationship with God. We have a covenant with God. We are God's chosen people. And because of that, it's not a transaction where we give him this and he gives us that. It's an ongoing thing. And in particular, our God requires us to act morally. He wants us to act according to the Ten Commandments. He wants us to not kill, and he wants us to not steal, and he wants us to worship him, and we have to do all that right. Otherwise, he gets angry with us, and he punishes us with things like the Babylonian captivity. And so this totally transforms religion, because now religion is something that each and every Hebrew person has to pay attention to. They're all supposed to be moral, right? God is watching all of them, and he gets angry at the people not if one person's acting immoral, but if enough people are acting immoral, God's going to punish the whole people. So they've all got to act moral, right? Morality now becomes an individual thing, and now you start to see a whole new sort of religion where it's about standards of living, and it's about a code of morality and how you live your life, and it's about organizing society, right? God is giving laws to organize and regulate society, to tell people how to live. That's something new. Now, I want to point out that this is in the 500s BC, and we're going to get into later, we're going to see that right about this time period, there's a slew of other religions and philosophies that are all emerging, which are focusing in a new way on morality and individual behavior, right? We're going to talk about all of that in a future lecture, but for right now, I just want to say the Hebrew people then created this monotheistic religion, which was a new thing, only one God, and he's the God of everything. And they created this idea of a covenant with God that required people to live a moral life according to a code handed down by God. And that's a completely new conception of religion that was created by the Hebrew people. And from that point onward, they called themselves Jews, which actually comes from Judea. And this religion is now Judaism. So that is the end of Lecture 2. I'll have a short discussion 2, but it won't be as long as discussion 1 was.